focus on the Constitution. Can you just
Constitution
point out some
chapter.
of the main things?
Sure, let me see that. Like I said, I've got this posted online, but from chapter 2, or pardon me, looking at the Constitution on here, we got a number of different things. We talked about the parts. What were the parts of the Constitution that we talked about?
I think the first one is like the longest one. It establishes the role of Congress.
That's right. Congress, Article 1, obviously is going to be dealing with the Congress. It is the longest and most specific one. What was Article 2? Article 2 was the executive or the presidency. So it was still fairly long, but they put these in order of importance. So Congress was supposed to be most important. President was second. Article 3? Judiciary, and it was the shortest of them all. And like I said, we'll talk about these a little bit more later. What came before Article 1?
Preamble.
What's the preamble?
Just basically said what the government was trying to do
Yeah,
and
Like
establish
against
the
King
principles of
George?
federalism.
Okay, kind of said what the government was going to do. What'd you start to say?
It said that established like the role of it starts with we the people. Right?
It does start with we the people,
So,
that's right.
First of all, it was that telling England that giving them the boot, saying that we're on our own. Is that
The
right?
preamble said we're giving the boot. Now, this is kind of a key thing, and I'm glad you brought this up. There was the Declaration of Independence, and then, of course, there's the Constitution. When you said the thing that was against King George and saying giving the boot to England, that was the Declaration of Independence. So why don't we deal with that one first, and we'll come back to the preamble. Declaration of Independence. I had several questions. Who, and who? Who was it written by? Jefferson. Who was it written about? King George. Who was it written for?
Potential allies.
Potential allies, and specifically France. Okay, what was the purpose behind them writing that declaration? Because there was a specific thing. I mean, when you think back to it, they call out King George. This is the part where they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What were they saying? Because I read through this in class. What was the purpose behind writing that? Not everybody at once. What were they justifying?
They were justifying the revolution.
They were justifying, and how did they justify the revolution?
By saying, I guess, saying what they were displeased about.
Yeah, they listed all those grievances against the king. And if you remember, the word that came up an awful lot in there was the word he, because they said he has erected, he has obstructed, he has dissolved, all of these negative verbs dealing with King George. So when you think about it, they're offering a legal justification for their revolution. And they said when a government fails its people, what is the people's responsibility at that point? To establish a new government or overthrow the existing one. So that's what they're doing in the Declaration of Independence. That's what they're doing in the Declaration. Now the preamble. Article 1 was Congress, Article 2 was Executive, Article 3 was Judiciary. What did the preamble do? Because this was Schoolhouse Rock, if you remember. This was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Schoolhouse Rock is on here, so make sure that you're familiar with that. What was the purpose behind the preamble? What did we say it did? Or, for that matter, what did we say it didn't do?
It wasn't like law binding, it just kind of.
That's true. The preamble has no legal significance whatsoever. So yeah, that's right. Has no legal significance whatsoever. So with this in mind, what did it really do?
It established like, the goals of the people and that allowed.
Yeah, it was an introduction. It established the goals. It was like when you write a paper, you're going to write that introductory paragraph that's going to lay out what you're going to say, and then the Constitution itself says it. So when you think back to it, it has no legal significance, but it is a nice, flowery, poetic introduction that in the grand scheme of things is supposed to lay out principles that are coming. Okay, Article 5, if I'm not mistaken. Article 4 was dealing with full faith and credit clause. Article 5, if you remember, was dealing with amendment. So we talked about fractions. What are the different fractions that we've spoken about so far?
2/3, 3/4.
Okay, 2/3. What's 2/3?
2/3.
After the bill gets vetoed.
Okay, you can have a congressional override of a veto with a 2/3 vote, and that was an example of what?
Checks and balances.
And it was an example of checks and balances, absolutely. Checks and balances, going back to it, if you remember, the idea that in order to prevent one branch from getting too powerful, the other branches had the ability to check their authority, and a presidential veto is an example of a check. And then, granted, the override with that 2/3 vote would be the example of another check of Congress over the president this time. So you got the 2/3.
Didn't 2/3 also relate to two different branches of government have to
Yeah.
work, have to work in cooperation?
The article Assault on Separation of Powers, and that's a really good catch. In dealing with separation of powers, it says in there typically it takes two branches of government working together in order to get certain things done. Like, give me an example of one of those.
I think it was in order to like officially declare war, like Congress has to declare it, but then the president can send troops.
Okay, the Congress declares the war, the president executes the actual declaration, that kind of a thing. The president, if he wants to wiretap, must go to which branch?
Judiciary?
Must go to the judiciary for the warrant, if you will, and then the executive will implement that warrant by literally wiretapping. And in that article, it was kind of saying that the Bush administration was acting alone instead of acting with the other ones. So that's a good catch, and that's an important article, so pay attention to that one. But what else with 2/3? 2/3 override,
2/3 vote to propose an amendment
2/3 of a vote from whom?
from the House and the Senate.
From the Congress. 2/3 of a vote from the House and Senate to propose. What was the 3/4 that several of you mentioned?
3/4 of the states have to ratify it.
3/4 of
Become
the
an
states, or 38 of the 50, have got to ratify in order for the amendment to become an actual part of the Constitution. And what was the one amendment that we specifically talked about that did not get ratified?
Equal opportunity, or equal.
It starts with equal.
ERA.
ERA. Equal earned run average. Baseball playoff.
Equal
No.
rights.
Equal rights amendment. Yeah, the ERA. Pay good attention to the Equal Rights Amendment too, because that one never got passed because they never quite got that 3/4. So we got 2/3, we got 3/4. Any others?
3/5.
3/5. What was 3/5?
Before the Civil, no, after the Civil War, I think, or was it before the Civil War?
Okay, it's either before or after the Civil War.
Population,
It was
how,
before.
how
Before.
slaves were counted for population.
How slaves were counted for population purposes. So if we're going back to the Virginia plan, if you remember, you were going to base representation based on population. The question was, how do you count slaves?
Yeah.
And what did they
It's
ultimately...
3/5 of a person.
Yeah, they said it would take 5 slaves to equal 3 people for representation and for taxation purposes. Yeah, so the South got representation, the North got the benefit of additional taxation in that regard. That's how they came up with it. But if a slave is a 3/5 of a person, what does that really mean the slave is?
Not a person.
Not a
Not a
person
person.
or less than a person, yeah. So 3/5. Anybody remember 9/13?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
what was that?
for
I don't know,
ratifying
I
the
have it right here,
Constitution.
What's that?
For when they had the Articles of Confederation, they
Right.
were trying to bring out the Constitution. They said 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it for it to become national government.
Ratification, I believe it was Article 7 of the Constitution. It deals with, and it says 9 of the 13 had to ratify in order for this to become binding. Why was it, again, thinking back to class, did they pick 9?
Because under the Articles of Confederation, to be 13 or 13, and Rhode Island wanted nothing to do with the Constitution, so they wouldn't have been able to pass it under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, everything had to be unanimous or 100% in order for a law to get passed under the Articles.
Yeah.
And this, if you remember in class, was when I asked you about pizza. And I said, what kind of pizza do you like? And nobody could agree. We got
Yeah.
3 or 4 different kinds. And my point was, well, if we can't agree on pizza, how in the frick are we going to be able to agree on serious things with all of these states involved? So they set it for 9/13. And you mentioned Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Rhode Island was the hell state, if you will, as far as the government was concerned. But they set 9 specifically because they knew they could get 9. 4 of them, if you remember, New York was one of them, Rhode Island was one of them, I believe Massachusetts was fairly close, and there was one other one that if you would have changed about 5 or 6 votes, it would not have passed.